The button was small, pale blue, wedged between the seat cushion and the armrest of Adrian's car, the kind of spot you only find when you're looking for something else entirely. Hazel Merritt wasn't looking for anything. She'd just dropped her phone and reached down without thinking. Her fingers found the button before her eyes did. Small, fabric-covered, the kind that comes off a woman's coat. Not her coat. She didn't own anything in that shade of blue. She held it in her palm the whole drive home. Adrian didn't notice. He talked about the highway construction on the 401, about the neighbor's dog that kept getting into the recycling, about whether they should redo the kitchen backsplash before winter. He talked the way he always did. Easy, relaxed, filling silence like he was afraid of what it might say. Hazel set the button on the kitchen counter when they got in. She didn't say anything about it. She made tea, answered some emails, and went to bed at the same time she always did. But she didn't sleep. She lay there in the dark listening to Adrian's breathing slow into sleep, and she thought, how long does it take a button to fall off a coat? How long does it take for someone to sit in a passenger seat long enough that a button works its way free and disappears into the gap? She thought about the last 3 months. The gym sessions that ran long, the client dinners she was never invited to anymore. The way he'd started sleeping with his phone face down on the nightstand, which he'd never done in 11 years of marriage. Small things. The kind of things you notice and then talk yourself out of noticing. Hazel was 37 years old. She'd spent 11 of those years building a life with this man, a house in Oakville, a daughter in grade 4, a joint mortgage, a shared calendar, a dog named Pepper who slept at the foot of their bed and had no idea anything was wrong. She gave him the benefit of the doubt for exactly 3 more weeks. Then she hired someone. It took the investigator 4 days. 4 days, and she had photographs, a name, a timeline that stretched back 8 months. The woman's name was Courtney. She worked at the architecture firm downtown where Adrian had taken on a consulting contract in February. She was 26. She had a condo near King Street West, and a very distinctive blue wool coat. Hazel sat in her car in the parking lot of Sobeys, and read the report twice. Then she drove home, made dinner, helped their daughter Paige with a science project about the water cycle, and said goodnight to Adrian like she always did. She was very calm. She was calm the way a city is calm before a blackout. Everything working, everything humming, and then, quietly every light going out at once. She didn't cry until Paige was asleep, and even then, it wasn't the kind of crying that falls apart. It was the kind that clarifies. She sat on the bathroom floor with her back against the tub, and she cried, and when she was done, she knew exactly what she was going to do. She called her best friend Maren the next morning. Maren had been her closest friend since university, since they'd lived across the hall from each other in residence and stayed up until 3 a.m. talking about everything and nothing. Maren picked up on the second ring and listened without interrupting, which was the only thing Hazel needed. Tell me what you need, Maren said when Hazel was done. I need a lawyer, Hazel said. And I need time. You have both. What Hazel did not do was confront Adrian. She understood something. Sitting there in the quiet of her kitchen with Pepper at her feet, and Paige's cereal bowl still on the counter. Confronting him would give him the chance to control the narrative, to apologize, to beg, to reframe. To make her look like the one in crisis, while he stood there looking reasonable. She didn't want reasonable. She wanted the truth to land somewhere he couldn't spin it. So she waited. She scheduled a meeting with a family lawyer named Patricia Osei, who had an office on Lakeshore and had been recommended by 3 different people as someone who did not mess around. She gathered documents, tax returns, bank statements, the mortgage paperwork. She moved a portion of her savings into an account he didn't know about, which Patricia advised her was entirely within her rights. She also kept her life exactly the same. She went to her job at the urban planning firm where she'd worked for 9 years. She picked Paige up from school. She made dinner. She laughed at Adrian's jokes. She watched television beside him on the couch, with her feet tucked under the throw blanket, and she did all of it with the knowledge settled in her chest like a stone. She knew, and he didn't know she knew, and there was a strange, terrible power in that. Adrian, for his part, seemed almost relieved. Whatever guilt he'd been managing in February and March had apparently settled into something more comfortable by now. He was easier than he'd been in months. More present, even, which she found in its own way the cruelest thing of all. He'd found a way to have both lives, and it had made him lighter. She saw a text once, by accident. She hadn't been looking. His phone was face up for once. He must have forgotten, and she was handing it to him across the kitchen island when the screen lit up. 3 words from a contact saved as C, "Can I tonight?" Adrian took the phone without looking at her. He slid it into his pocket and said something about taking Pepper for a walk. He was gone 20 minutes. Hazel stood at the kitchen island and thought about the 11 years. The morning he'd proposed on a Tuesday, not a special occasion. Just a Tuesday in November. Over scrambled eggs in their first apartment. Because he said he didn't want to wait for a moment that felt right when this moment already was. The way he'd held her hand through 31 hours of labor when Paige came. The way they used to sit on the back porch on summer evenings and talk about nothing and everything until the mosquitoes drove them inside. When had that stopped? She couldn't pinpoint the date. She just knew that at some point the porch evenings had quietly ended, and she'd noticed and then unnoticed, the way you do. Patricia had everything ready by the end of the month. The papers were drawn. The asset list was complete. Hazel had thought carefully about what she wanted and what she didn't, and Patricia had translated all of it into language that was precise and airtight. There was one thing left to decide: how. It was Marin who gave her the idea, actually. Not deliberately. They were having dinner at a small Italian place in the West End. Just the two of them, a Thursday night, and Marin mentioned offhand that she'd run into someone from Hazel's firm at Italy that week, and Hazel had looked down at her pasta and thought, the restaurant. She knew the restaurant. Adrian had mentioned it 3 times in the past 2 months, without ever suggesting they go together, which told her everything. A place called Aldgate, in the financial district, the kind of room that had good lighting and a long wine list and meant something when you took someone there. He'd taken Courtney there twice, according to the investigator's report. A Friday night, then a Saturday. A regular table apparently, near the window. Hazel made a reservation for that Friday, under her own name, and she called the restaurant, asked to speak with the manager, and had a quiet, specific conversation that the manager, a composed man named Jerome, received with complete professionalism. Jerome confirmed that Adrian did have a reservation for that same evening. He said he would handle the rest. She asked Marin to come and sit 2 tables away. On Friday evening, Hazel wore a dress she hadn't worn in 2 years, charcoal gray, understated. She did her hair simply. She wore the earrings her mother had given her when she and Adrian got married. Small gold hoops she almost never wore, because they felt too important for ordinary days. She arrived first. She had a glass of sparkling water and read the menu she wasn't planning to order from, and thought about Paige, who was at Marin's parents' place for the night. She thought about the apartment she'd looked at in Burlington last week, bright, south-facing, a small balcony with a view of the escarpment. She'd put down a deposit that afternoon. Marin arrived and took her table near the bar. She ordered wine and opened a book. She looked completely unremarkable, which was the point. Adrian and Courtney arrived at 7:15. Hazel watched them come through the door without moving. She had wondered, in the weeks of planning, how it would feel to see them together in person. Whether the sight of it would break something open in her. Whether she'd lose the stillness she'd been holding. But watching them come through the door, his hand at the small of Courtney's back, she felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. The kind that comes when you finally stop waiting for something you already know. They were taken to their table. It was across the room from Hazel's. Far enough that Adrian didn't see her immediately, near the window. Exactly where the report had placed them. Hazel watched Courtney slide into her seat, and shake out her napkin and smile at something Adrian said, and she thought, she's been asking him when. He'd told the investigator, in a message recovered in the digital forensics, that Courtney had been pushing him to make a decision since March. You need to tell her, she'd apparently written. You can't keep doing this to both of us. Both of us. As though Courtney were also a victim of Adrian's delay, as though sitting in this window seat at Aldgate and ordering the tasting menu with someone else's husband were a burden she'd had no choice but to take on. Adrian saw Hazel when the waiter passed their table. She watched the exact moment, the way his eyes tracked across the room automatically, the way recognition hit him in phases. First just a woman in a gray dress, then a familiar woman, then Hazel, his wife. He went very still. Hazel held his gaze and didn't smile. Jerome arrived at their table with the precision of someone who had done exactly what he'd promised. He carried a sealed envelope on a small silver tray and set it in front of Adrian with the quiet courtesy of someone delivering a perfectly ordinary thing. Compliments of the evening, Jerome said, and stepped away. Adrian stared at the envelope. Courtney looked at it, then at him, then across the room, following whatever had made his color change, and found Hazel watching from 2 tables away. He opened it slowly. Hazel didn't look away. She watched him read the first page, watched the understanding move through him the way cold moves through a building when a window breaks. Sudden, total, settling into every corner. Across the room, Maren quietly set her book down and picked up her wine. Courtney spoke first, a low, urgent sound that Hazel couldn't hear from this distance. Adrian said something back. Courtney's expression shifted into something that Hazel, even from here, could read clearly. The particular realization of a woman who has just understood that the situation she thought she controlled was never hers to control. She'd been asking when. The answer had been, not in the way she imagined. Hazel stood. She gathered her coat and her bag. She walked across the restaurant, not toward their table, not in a wide arc around it, but in a straight, direct line toward the door which happened to take her past where they were sitting. She stopped beside the table. Adrian looked up at her. He looked the way she'd expected. Wrecked, caught, already calculating. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours," Hazel said conversationally, as though they'd bumped into each other at a grocery store. "Paige is at the Hendersons tonight. Appreciate it if you'd call before you come to the house." She looked at Courtney once. Not with anger, and not with pity. Just a clear, brief look that said, "I see you." Then she walked out. The October air hit her when she pushed through the door, cool and carrying the smell of the lake, the way Toronto air does in autumn when the wind is coming from the right direction. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, and Maren came out 30 seconds later and fell into step beside her without a word. They walked 2 blocks before either of them spoke. "You good?" Maren said. Hazel thought about it honestly. Her chest felt strange, not broken, exactly, but like a room after furniture has been moved out. Emptier than before, cleaner. "Yeah," she said, "I think I actually am." The next few months were not easy. She was clear-eyed enough to know they wouldn't be. There were custody conversations and asset divisions and a lot of paperwork spread across Patricia's boardroom table. There were evenings when Paige asked questions. Hazel didn't know how to answer simply, and evenings when the apartment felt very large and very quiet, and she sat with Pepper, who she'd kept, and who seemed to understand that something had changed, and let herself feel whatever arrived. Adrian called twice in the first week. The first time, she didn't pick up. The second time she did. "I just want to talk," he said. "We can talk through Patricia," she said, and ended the call. She felt no particular satisfaction in it. She wasn't performing coldness, she was just finished. There's a difference, and she understood it clearly now. She wasn't punishing him by not engaging. She simply had nothing left to say to him that hadn't already been said in that sealed envelope on a silver tray. Courtney, she heard later through people who worked in Adrian's industry, had stopped seeing him shortly after the restaurant. Whether Adrian had ended it or she had, Hazel didn't know, and found she didn't much care. What she did notice, and found quietly satisfying, was the rest of it. The way the news of the divorce had moved through their professional circles, the way the story had a way of establishing itself, before Adrian could get ahead of it. He wanted to frame it as a mutual decision, an amicable separation. But the image of his wife walking into that restaurant, and handing him papers while he was on a date had a way of preceding him into rooms. That was never Hazel's intention, exactly. But she didn't mourn it either. By February she had a routine she was beginning to recognize as her own. The Burlington apartment had turned out to be even better than she'd expected. Morning light across the kitchen floor. A farmer's market on Saturday, enough distance from the old neighborhood to feel like a genuine beginning, and not just an aftermath. She'd started running again. Something she'd given up somewhere around Paige's 2nd birthday. She ran along the waterfront trail in the cold, breath visible, thinking about nothing particular. Paige adjusted the way children do. Not without struggle, but with a directness that Hazel both admired and found heartbreaking. She asked where Daddy was going to live. She asked if they were still a family. Hazel told her the truth in the simplest form she could find. That they were still her parents and always would be, and that families come in all kinds of shapes, and that she was loved by both of them more than she'd ever have words to understand. Paige had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Okay, can I have cereal?" Hazel had laughed. A real laugh, the surprising kind, and said yes. Her mother called every Sunday. Her colleagues at the firm, who had known something was off for months without saying so, quietly redistributed her workload during the worst weeks and increased it again when she came back ready. A colleague named Renata, who had been through a divorce herself 6 years earlier, left a book on her desk one morning with a post-it note that said only, "Page 47. Hazel read page 47. It was a passage about how the end of something and the beginning of something else are not always separated by silence. Sometimes they are exactly the same moment. She returned the book with a post-it note that said, "Accurate." She thought sometimes about the button, that small pale blue button, sitting on her palm in the car, and how ordinary it had looked. How little it had seemed to deserve the weight of what it was carrying. She'd held it, and driven home, and made tea, and gone to bed, and nothing had been the same since, but she was beginning to understand that the unsaneness was not only loss. Some of it was reclamation. She started work on a new planning project in March. A community development proposal for a neighborhood in Hamilton. The kind of project that required thinking about how people move through spaces, how a streetscape can either invite people in or hold them at a distance. She worked on it in the evenings at the kitchen table while Paige did homework nearby, the two of them quiet in the way that is full rather than empty. She still wore the gold earrings sometimes, because of what they'd meant before, but because she'd decided they meant something different now. Something she hadn't needed to name yet. One evening in April, Maren came for dinner, and they opened a bottle of wine, and sat on Hazel's small balcony even though it was still a little cold, wrapped in blankets, and talked until past midnight the way they hadn't in years. About everything and nothing. About what Hazel wanted the next chapter to look like, not in terms of romance or success but just, what did a good life feel like when you were building it on your own terms? Hazel thought about it. The light from the escarpment was faint and steady to the south. Less managed, she said finally. I want it to feel less like I'm managing everything and more like I'm actually in it. Maren raised her glass. That sounds about right, she said. There was no dramatic ending, no great speech, no visible victory lap, no moment where everything resolved itself into something clean and certain. Life doesn't work that way, and Hazel knew it well enough not to expect otherwise. What there was. A morning in May, 6 months after the restaurant, when she woke up early before her alarm and lay in the quiet apartment, and realized she'd slept through the night without once reaching for her phone, without once surfacing from some dream of the old house, the old life, the version of herself that used to hold buttons in her palm and not say anything. She got up. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window while the light came in and thought, I did the work. Not perfectly, not without cost. But she had gathered herself, and protected what mattered, and acted when she was ready, and walked out of that restaurant with her coat on and her head clear, and everything after that had been hers to build. Pepper padded in from the bedroom and sat at her feet, looking up at her with the reliable expectation of someone who needed breakfast. She set down her coffee and fed the dog and started her morning, as herself, from the beginning.